that, but we'll hear what their concerns are as they come up and share later. But this is just to allow for larger hydro to be considered and to give our utilities a chance to weigh all options in looking at having a robust energy portfolio from a number of sources as we move to the next generation. So, Mr. Chair, that's a general overview of the bill. I believe there are a couple people that wish to speak to the bill, and I'm open to either questions now or turning it to our testifiers.
Thank you, Senator Matthews. We have 2 testifiers currently on the list. Then we'll take anybody from the audience that may be interested in speaking in favor or against this bill. Eric Swanson from Manitoba Hydro and Deborah Bergen, Missouri River Energy Services. Please, if you would step to the podium or to the testifier's desk. We'll start with Mr. Swanson. Please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Senator Matthews, and committee members. My name is Eric Swanson. I work with Winthrop and Weinstein, and we represent Manitoba Hydro. Members may not be aware that Manitoba Hydro and hydro generally from Canada has played a key role in Minnesota's energy supply for over 50 years already. And one of the attributes of hydro is that it creates a significant offset in greenhouse gas emissions compared to traditional sources of electricity. In fact, we've estimated that in 2017, exports from Manitoba Hydro to the broader upper Midwest reduced global net greenhouse gas emissions by the equivalent of removing approximately 1.7 million vehicles from the road. It can be a significant piece of the puzzle if that's our target. We're here supporting the bill because current statutes do have conflicting definitions. In places, hydroelectric is considered renewable. In places, it doesn't count. And from our perspective, whatever the merits of those distinctions when they were first enacted, and it's been almost 20 years ago now that those were first enacted, they just don't hold true today. Hydroelectricity really is unique among renewables because it's not only clean, it's not only non-emitting, it's flexible and it's dispatchable. That makes it a perfect complement to other renewables that the state is encouraging and pursuing, whether it's wind or solar. Using renewable hydropower as a backstop in Manitoba's reservoirs essentially serves as an energy storage capability that allows Minnesota to actually further develop its in-state renewables. And perhaps the best example of that that you may be aware of is the recent partnership between Manitoba Hydro and Minnesota Power. We're working together now building the Great Northern Transmission Line to enable increased sale of hydro into the U.S. markets. In turn, Manitoba will be taking sales of wind power when it's beneficial for both parties from the Dakotas. It's a partnership. It's not a competition. These resources work very, very well together. And given that, we think it's time to remove the distinction between quote-unquote small and large hydro. And that's all I have. I'd be happy to answer questions.
Sure. Any questions for this testifier? Senator Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Swanson. Just one quick question. Can you just kind of give us an idea what the current capacity of Manitoba Hydro is in terms of generation?
Mr. Swanson.
Sure. There are both the current existing facilities, which includes a very recent smaller for Manitoba facility, a little over 200 megawatts, called the Wasquatum facility, that was built in conjunction with the Nissachawasik Cree Nation there. And there's currently under construction another facility that's a little under 700 megawatts, the Kiosk facility, that's being developed in partnership with 4 First Nations. There's also significant additional untapped potential Whether that comes to fruition down the road or not will depend on any number of factors, but Manitoba has about 4,000 additional megawatts that could be developed in the future. So there's a significant resource there if we want to take advantage of it.
Any further questions for this testifier? Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And to either the author or to the individual from Manitoba Hydro, just definitionally, is there a definition for hydropower? And I'll just back up. The reason for my question, would pumped hydro apply to this application?
Mr. Swanson.
Mr. Chair, Senator Senjum, I'm not aware of any pumped hydro project that would come close to being over 100 megawatts in size.
No.
And certainly none of the Manitoba projects are that. They are all now essentially run-of-the-river projects, so we're building within the riverbanks. So I don't envision a scenario where pumped hydro could qualify under this.
Senator Senjum.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You see it in Europe, and unless we've on line 1-12 sort of we've struck any reference to any capacity. So it would seem to me large or small would be applicable here, and at least in terms of the definition. And were there a pumped hydro? You see it in Europe. It seems to me that would apply here.
Senator
Matthews.
Matthews.
Missing something.
Mr. Chair, Senator Senjum, yes, I believe that still would apply with the definition, and this hopefully will equalize smaller hydro generation and larger generation and allow for both.
Further questions? Seeing none, we'll move to the next testifier. Ms. Bergen, please introduce yourself for the record and begin your testimony.
Hello, my name is Deborah Bergen. I'm the Director of Government and State Legislative Affairs at Missouri River Energy Services. We are a joint action agency that provides supplemental power to municipal electric utilities. Just by way of background, many of our municipal electric utility members, 24 of which are located in Minnesota, get an allocation of hydroelectricity off the dams of the Missouri. That electricity is from dams that are operated by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they purchase the electricity from WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration. Now, when we look at the language on page 2, I should first of all say overall we're supportive of this bill, but we do see a strange unintended consequence when we look at the stricken language on page 2. Now, before I was ever working in Minnesota or working for Missouri River Energy Services, I was told that language originally came out of discussion with the original renewable energy objective. I'm sorry, all I have is hearsay on this, but what I was told was when they were talking about the renewable energy objective before it became a standard, there was a question about the hydroelectric power from WAPA off the dams of the Missouri. And apparently the question was, well, if we count that power, many of the municipals and cooperatives will already meet the renewable energy objective without having to do a thing. Well, that's not fair. Well, the cooperatives and municipals brought out, well, if we count that power as part of our sales for the calculation of the renewable energy objective, that means we're building renewables on top of renewables. Well, that's not fair. So the agreement was, okay, WAPA power won't count as sales for the calculation of meeting the renewable energy objective and later the renewable energy standard, and it won't count for compliance. With the striking of the language, it says it doesn't count anymore as, it will count as sales. So for example, let's just say for Missouri River Energy Services, just to pick round numbers out of the air, let's say overall in 1 year we sell 100 megawatt hours of power overall. To calculate the renewable energy standard of 25%, again, I'm just using straight numbers, right now, the way the law works, say 50 megawatt hours of that came from WAPA, we'd exclude that. So we'd calculate the 25% on the remaining 50 megawatt hours. What this says is we have to calculate that 25% on the 100 megawatt hours. So it increases our sales and will increase the amount of renewables we'd have to build, but we couldn't count the WAPA power as part of the compliance. And the reason we can't count it as compliance is actually in 216B.1691 subdivision 4, which set out the compliance for the original renewable energy standard. That required that the state of Minnesota would have to create an energy tracking system, and that was done. MRETS, the Midwest Renewable Energy Tracking System. And as part of that, the generator, the owner of the generation, has to file with MRETS. Well, in this case, the owner of the generation is actually the federal government, so we can't make them register with MRETS so that we can retire credits with MRETS. So it's a complicated process. I know you're nodding, Senator Osmick. It creates a complication. I think it can be fixed. I just don't have the fix today. But we would like to continue to work with the committee and with the author on trying to fix this strange dichotomy it creates. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Bergen. Yes, it sounds like there's a little unintended consequence happening. We are not moving the bill today, so we do have some time yet before the omnibus bill comes out, and this may or may not be a part of it. So, members, any questions for this testifier? Seeing none, thank you both for testifying with us today.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to testify for or against Senate File 1372? Seeing no stampede, Senator Matthews, final comments?
Mr. Chair, I thank you for the discussion on this bill. I had this explanation from Ms. Bergen earlier today, and I too will keep working with her to figure out exactly what we need the bill to say in order to reach at the issues that she's trying to bring up. And so I'll work with her and with council, and we can continue that on in the future.
Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think Ms. Bergen's testimony explains why I have a problem with the bill. I mean, in this case, she's mentioning that not intended by the author, but that this would in effect mean that Missouri River would have to, if they're getting half of their retail electric sales from hydropower from WAPA, that therefore their renewable energy standard would double on them overnight, and they don't, that's an unintended consequence and so on. And I'd say the same thing about the rest of the bill. I'm a believer that large hydro has a role to play in our system, a big role and probably a growing role to play in the system. But in effect, if you just say, okay, now we're going to allow this, and all of a sudden it changes everybody's calculation. What we should be doing if we want to include it in the calculation for renewable energy is to modify the renewable energy standards to make that account. This bill simply says, okay, we're going to change what the renewable energy standards are by saying we're going to count something that, I don't know what Xcel gets, 3, 4, 5%, Minnesota Power, I don't know what they get, but it's probably more than that now. It's basically just changing their renewable energy standards without making any change other than a definition of what counts as it. So if we want to do something, if the goal is to increase use of hydroelectric power, I wouldn't have a problem with doing that. I think that might be a good thing to do, but if so, the renewable energy standards should be modified to reflect this. And unless we're going to get into a huge discussion on this topic about renewable energy standards, I think doing this on its own causes a huge change in the renewable energy standard for anybody using large hydro here, just as the stricken language on the back page causes a huge impact on the renewable energy standard in the opposite direction for Missouri River. So, Mr. Chair, with that, I would oppose the bill if it was done in the right way with changing renewable energy standards to account for this in some rational way. I'd say that's a good thing to do.
Thank you, Senator Marty. Again, this is being laid over, so this is not ready for prime time. I'm sure the author will continue to discuss this and deal with what he wants to do with the bill as amended if that happens. Senator Dibble?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have much to add to what Senator Marty already said. He articulated much of what I was going to say. I was just going to mention that, of course, hydroelectric is a renewable energy that has little or no environmental consequence. Well, not counting, of course, the damming and the, some of the destruction that Manitoba Hydro has represented for the native communities up there. But it's relatively clean, especially with respect to the climate, so it's a good thing. So on the one hand, what Senator Matthews is pursuing is logical, and I myself have been the legislative champion of a hydroelectric facility, small scale, that was installed in downtown Minneapolis on the river, bolstered by REPI payments out of the RDF, actually. But I do get concerned when we're sweeping in, taking out the capacity of less than 100 megawatts, getting away from some of the original other goals of the renewable development standard to really get smaller scale and some localized economic benefit out of the renewable development standard. So I'm concerned about Senate File 1372. Thank you.
Seeing Senator Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Senator Matthews, thanks for bringing the bill forward. I'm obviously a co-author on the bill, and independent of the issue that we have on page 2, which I'm sure will get resolved before we get to the end here, I just want to speak briefly in support of the bill, because I think we're at a crossroads here in Minnesota, as well as probably across the world, as folks continue to debate climate change and the impact of carbon emissions on the atmosphere and how we address that going forward, whether that's a change in our renewable energy standard or whether that's a change in how we look at things that we currently have in practice. I think, to use your analogy, having as many options available to us as we can makes some sort of sense. And the fact of the matter is that we have utilities that are purchasing power that would now be included, and I think that's smart, because I think that as we go forward, we have to consider all options. A little bit later, we're going to be talking about nuclear power, and for many years, that was something that we didn't want to talk about. But I think it's important that we have these conversations as we go forward, because if nothing else, I'm guessing that most of us can agree that reducing carbon emissions into the atmosphere is probably a good thing. And as we consider this provision, I think it's different than it was in 2007. The landscape is different than it was in 2007. The challenges that we face as a society are different than they were in 2007. And I think this is the type of thing that probably made good sense at the time. But I think the change that you're proposing here makes good sense at this time. And I think as we get to the end and put together a bill, I hope that this can make it through. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Seeing no further discussion, we will lay over Senate File 1372 for possible inclusion in the omnibus bill from this committee.
All right, next up, Senate File 633, Senator Osmek.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Senate File 633 is something that I've been proposing every biennium since I came to this body. This is the lifting of the prohibition on nuclear power plants in Minnesota. Also addresses storage. We put this ban in place many years ago. And at one point in time, there seemed to be momentum for us to lift the ban. This does not prescribe that we're going to be building any nuclear facilities. This does not prescribe and demand that the PUC allow them. This allows nuclear power for the future of Minnesota to be part of the conversation, that it can be part of the integrated resource plan that will be produced this year by one of the IOUs. But also it needs to be a conversation when we're dealing with renewable energy. We just saw what happened in Minnesota when the polar vortex hit us, and we went below 22 degrees, below zero. Our facilities, our wind facilities, shut down by design. We need to have baseload generation that is clean to back it up, and we can get into debate whether the costs are there. We can get into a debate whether it's clean, though I would submit to you that it really is, because the waste that is provided doesn't go into the atmosphere. It comes out into a canister and we put it on a pad. Toxic as it may be, at least you know where it is. So there are benefits that I certainly see on having nuclear energy as part of the portfolio, and Senator Simonson hit on it, and I've said it many times. We must have a portfolio that is diverse, because when you have a polar vortex and your renewables are not transmitting energy onto the grid, you have to have alternatives. They all work in concert. Nuclear energy, it can be a base load energy, in my opinion, clean, for the future of Minnesota. And again, this is not prescriptive to say we're going to start building another nuclear power plant, much less replacing them. What it says is this can now be back into the discussion on what we're going to do after 2032 when we begin to see the licenses expire for our existing 3 nuclear reactors. That is all this is. And it should not be painted as anything but that. We're not going to start digging shovels full of dirt and start building anything. This is to make sure that we have an ability to keep this as part of our energy mix. And I think it's a wise thing to do. With that, Mr. Chair, I will take any testifiers who would like to testify in behalf or against the bill.
There is one person on the list who asked to testify ahead of time, Margaret Levine. Welcome to the committee. Please state your name on the record and then proceed.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Chair and committee members. My name is Margaret Levin, and I'm here today as State Director of the Sierra Club's Minnesota North Star chapter. We represent 80,000 members and supporters working to help our state's communities flourish through environmental protection, and I appreciate the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you regarding Senate File 633 on an issue that we have a long history with. We strongly oppose lifting the moratorium on new nuclear plants here in Minnesota. Nuclear continues to pose grave risks, is expensive for ratepayers, impacts communities already disproportionately affected by environmental problems and our clean water resources, and leaves an incredible burden of toxic pollution for future generations. That is why, in 1971, Minnesota State Senator Nicholas Coleman introduced the bill to create a moratorium on new nuclear plants until they can be defined as safe. Senator Coleman and legislators understood then the long-term burden that nuclear power leaves for future generations. The moratorium in law is a wise and sensible step that says we cannot further add to a problem that doesn't yet have an acceptable solution. Among our top concerns is the issue of safety, including for storage and shipping of high-level waste, which we must deal with for the next 250,000 years for the waste that we've already created. Another problem is the cost of new nuclear proposals, which continues to increase while clean and renewable energy becomes more affordable. Our dollars could be used much more effectively by investing in wind, solar, storage, energy efficiency, and grid modernization. And further, the jobs created by building new nuclear power plants are far more expensive and take much longer to create than investing in the clean, renewable energy economy. Our present nuclear power plants are located on the banks of the Mississippi, where an accident would not only impact the local communities, but also millions of people downstream. Nuclear energy results in radioactive contamination throughout its life cycle, especially for low-income and indigenous communities living near uranium mines, mills, plants, and storage, as has been referenced. And we are also concerned about the impacts on Minnesota's precious water resources and the communities that depend on them. The cooling of nuclear power requires significant amounts of groundwater, and thermal energy production is already one of the largest users of water in our state. In conclusion, nuclear power is controversial for good reason, and much better solutions exist for our power needs. We agree with the leaders that came before us that until solutions can be found to answer these concerns, the nuclear moratorium should remain.
Thank you, Ms. Levin. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a couple of different comments in response. Every form of energy has a grave risk. Every form of it in a different type. I mean, with our coal facilities, you have fly ash that comes out of it, and you have CO2 that's expended into the atmosphere. The safety, I mean, we understand what nuclear energy is. I certainly hope that the next time we have a discussion about solar energy, that the Sierra Club is also going to be here testifying and having serious, grave concerns about what we're going to do with solar panels when those toxic metals and that toxic, the toxic parts of those have to be disposed of, because that certainly is part of solar energy. Also, when the testifier talks to wind and solar energy, those are not base load. We have to have a base load, and there's no configuration until energy storage becomes a very viable option to augment renewable energy, and that is not on the horizon. We did have a bill, members, if you remember, that we passed off the Senate floor with all green votes to begin down that path. But as of the current time and for the foreseeable future, the renewables such as wind and solar are not base load. About 30% of our energy that comes into the lights that we have on in this building, in this room right now, come from our reactors. It needs to be dealt with. And again, that is not to say that we are prescribing by the legislature. We are not telling the PUC what to do. This has to be dealt with at the PUC, which is the body we have created to deal with what is expensive, what is not, what's in the ratepayer's best interest, and weighing all of these decisions. I think it is actually short-sighted for us to not have nuclear, regardless of whether we're going to build anything or not, as part of the equation. That's all this bill is. So, thank you.
Senator Marty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. When you asked if we had any questions for the witness, I did not think we were going to call more witnesses. But I did have several comments to make. And one,
Senator Marty, I don't think your mic is on.
Thank you. I did have one general comment about the bill. I agree with Ms. Levin about the issue here. I think that Senator Osmick saying that there's waste that there's products that when you have solar panels that get taken apart, you've got waste you have to deal with, much of which could be or should be recovered and so on. And I think that's not a difficult challenge to do. How we deal with the nuclear waste is a huge one that has not been resolved. And I do recall when they said electricity would be penny cheap or too cheap to meter because nuclear power was going to be such a efficient, inexpensive thing. But I think your comment about baseload is changing. You still say we need baseload, and I think that conversation is significantly shifting over the years because, as you acknowledge and as you're carrying the bill on storage, there have been lots of changes, and even intermittent sources, when plugged together in a whole network of things, fills the gaps and can address the needs. So while at this time we would acknowledge, I think everybody acknowledges that we have some need for some ongoing, what you call baseload plants, but I think that conversation is and will continue to change quickly. When Ms. Levin said that Nick Coleman, the former Senate Majority Leader, had worked on this in the 1970s. I know it didn't pass then, though, because I worked on it in the late 80s and early 90s, and that's about the time I think it passed. But I think this bill, and I think the chair recognizes that the bill doesn't do much. It's a message. We've had, I think one of your previous times at this, when we had hearings on it, had opponents and proponents, and I, as chair, had listed XL Energy as other because they wanted to comment on the bill, and I've always heard them say they're not having any intent to do this, and they corrected me. No, we do support the bill to repeal it because we don't like anyone telling us what we can or cannot do. So, but were they planning to do it then? No. Are they planning to do anything now? I don't know. And I think I would not dispute, I mean, I think our number one energy and environmental challenge for the years ahead is carbon and climate change. So yes, if nuclear power does fill a role in that, it may well do so. But I think that at this point, you got to acknowledge that every time somebody's pushing nuclear power with some new technology or some, all we have to do is this, and it's going to happen, and we're going to somehow get rid of the waste somehow. Every time it keeps getting more expensive. Every time we upgrade or fix or maintain the current reactors we have in Minnesota, the cost overruns are huge. And this is an industry that, I mean, we talk about subsidized energy because we are subsidizing most forms of energy, including all the renewables at this time. The cost curve on those is going like this. The cost curve on nuclear, I don't know if it continues to go up, but it's a lot higher than it was 10 years ago, a lot higher than it was 20 years ago. And my concern about doing this, I think in many ways it's a distraction from other things because, again, I don't think it changes anything. I don't think Xcel, and I can sort of guarantee the other utilities aren't looking at nuclear right now. And if there was some new breakthrough, some new way of addressing some of the concerns, the waste, the highly toxic radioactive waste, if there was some way to address the security and safety issues of it, preventing catastrophic things. And granted, there are very few catastrophic meltdowns in history. There are very few nuclear power plants, relative speaking, to wind turbines or other things. But we wouldn't have a nuclear industry without the Price-Anderson Act, without the federal government subsidizing it on a permanent basis, because they couldn't afford the liability. So I don't think this is an industry that's going to happen. My biggest objection to how it's pushed every time in the U.S. is that if it's going to be built, it'll be built at ratepayers' expense twice. First, to build it, because it's too expensive. Investors don't want to take the risk on that anymore, so it seems to be the only plants that ever move forward in recent decades are ones where ratepayers pay as it's built, and then they pay again to buy the power from it. And so when the power plants that they start construction on shut down, it's the ratepayers who take the hit, not the investors. So I guess I have huge concerns about the idea that whenever it's being proposed, whenever it moves forward, it ends up being something the ratepayers pay the tab for up front. But I don't think this is, I think this is more symbolic. I don't support it, but I understand why you're pushing it. And I fundamentally, I'd be interested to be proven wrong, but I can't. I think Xcel would be up here testifying in favor if they thought there was any chance of it happening. And again, if there's some new technology, some new way of addressing the waste, some new way of making it work better and in an affordable manner, I think if that time comes, there'll be people on both parties eager to repeal this prohibition. And you may succeed at repealing it this year, but if you do, it's more sending a political message than it is accomplishing something.
So, Senator Marty, I am to assume you voted for the proposal in 1971 then, to begin with.
Senator Matthews, I was not in the legislature then. And it did not happen until the 90s, I believe. The early 90s, I think, was when it passed. But I was interested to hear that former Senator Coleman back that early had proposed this. And
Senator Osmick.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Senator Marty and I have a disagreement on this. We have every year that I've been here. That's good. That's why we're here. Regarding the waste, I did want to bring to the attention of the committee, just to make sure it's on the record, we do have a letter from the Prairie Island Tribe regarding the waste. We have actually heard earlier this year that reprocessing could be done in France. And I'd be very entertained by taking all of our waste and sending it to France. Maybe that's revenge for things that they've done to us. I don't know. That being aside the point, my whole emphasis here is that we're not making a decision. I don't think we should tie the hands of the Public Utilities Commission. That's what this does. This says you can't do it, and then we're telling the PUC it's not part of the equation. And Senator Marty, regarding the price, some of that is self-inflicted because of some of the regulations and authority that is put upon them, probably rightfully so, because have we had a meltdown? No. Have we had a Chernobyl? No. Have we had a Fukushima? No. Frankly, I haven't seen a lot of tidal waves in Minnesota in recent history, so I think we're probably safe on that one. That being said, the determination on if it is right for the ratepayers to pay doesn't exist with this body. That's why we created the PUC. And I think you and I both agree that the PUC should be making the determinations. I just don't want to tie their hands, and that's the biggest reason I have brought this bill forward. I think the testifier would probably like to say something, or you were making lots of notes probably to rebut me. So I'd love to give a second opinion. So,
Ms. Levin.
Chair, Senator, I appreciate the opportunity and just had a few comments. I think that will echo some of Senator Marty's comments. But first, to appreciate the point about recycling is important for all of our energy sources, including solar and wind. But I would take issue with the comparison between the issues posed by the long-term recycling of solar panels and the deadly consequences and issues around a permanent solution for high-level radioactive waste. I also appreciate the question about baseload power because I think that is oft mentioned and it is an important one. But as Senator Marty explained, I think we are seeing the development of new technologies, including the role of a distributed energy grid in actually supplying the baseload energy that we need through wind, solar, and energy efficiency, and through modernization of our electric grid. And we'll continue to see the acceleration of clean energy technologies that will make that even more possible. Regarding carbon, there was a recent report, Minnesota's Smarter Grid, that found Minnesota can decarbonize. We can meet our goals without building new nuclear plants and without extending the licenses of our current nuclear power plants. So I think we also see the data and the modeling that shows we have a truly clean and renewable energy future ahead of us, and that the future is indisputably clean.
Mr. Chair?
Senator Rosmick.
Funny she should bring up that particular smart grid analysis or study. I was actually looking at that today, and I thought it was very interesting some of the assumptions that had by 2050, that we would by 2050 have 70+% electric vehicles. That was one of the assumptions, and not only residential vehicles but also commercial fleet vehicles. It also said that we were going to be converting our natural gas natural gas furnaces in our homes and at commercial levels into heat pumps. And the study, and I didn't have a lot of time to look for it, the study didn't actually talk about and I just threw a number at it, trillions of dollars worth of cost to the consumer at home or the commercial industrial base to actually make that happen. Laudable goals, certainly, but to say that we would suddenly go 100%, and now I understand where the emails are coming from. It's coming from our friends at the Sierra Club are generating them to some members of the legislature. There are some significant questions I have for that report, as well as the fact is the report was not necessarily generated by I guess I would call an intellectual institution such as a university or some type of unbiased organization. It was created by an organization that gets paid to create these reports, not necessarily one that actually is studying them as part of our smart energy grid. So I have questions regarding the report, and I'm not here to debate the report. I think I'm going a little astray of where we started in this conversation, that this really is a bill to allow us to have it as part of our energy mix, and I'll leave it at that.
Senator Pratt, I hope you'll rein us back into the energy discussion.
I've been enjoying the discussion, Mr. Chair, and I don't know if I don't have a question as much as a comment. and it goes to something that Senator Marty said and Ms. Levin said, is that technology changes. And, you know, Senator Senjum and I have been talking about renewable energy, how the technology has made it more competitive in the marketplace. But it's my understanding, since we started talking about this in 1971, that nuclear technology has greatly improved as well. And demand for electricity will only grow as we go forward, and especially as we start to, as was mentioned, electrify our transportation. I don't know if we'll get to 70% by 2050, but you know, we are seeing more of that going on. I have to take exception, though, Ms. Levin, with the comment that this is a bad investment. I think that's a bit presumptuous. I don't think that you or I can make that determination. That's got to be made by the people willing to invest their money into that project. And maybe I'm being a bit naive here, but it seems to me that lifting this ban is the only way that we're going to have this conversation to look at all carbon-free sources of energy, if that's what's important to us. And I'm sympathetic to the letter from the Prairie Island, because it's also by lifting that ban that we'll really start to have a good conversation about what to do with the waste.
Senator Simonson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very good conversation. And I need to just say a couple of things on the record, I think, that are generally relative to the underlying bill, and then we'll get to there. Senator Osbeck, I find myself in a really unique situation this session, in that I feel like had I been keeping track, I will tend to agree with you more than I disagree with you. And that's a unique situation, perhaps. But today I'm going to disagree with the underlying bill, but I do need to say a few things, because I think it's part of the conversation. I think members, and to the public as well that pays attention to the world of energy, this discussion is going to have to continue, right? I mean, this is not going to go away anytime soon, no matter what we do here today or this session or next session. I think you're seeing that in the bills that are coming forward from various places, that there is a sense of urgency to make a change. And I think it's part of our job here as legislators to tamper some of the urgency, recognize that it's important, yes, but it's also important to make change in such a way that doesn't put our economies into a tailspin. And I will continue to speak this way about this issue because I represent northern Minnesota, and it's very important to me when we talk about what is often referred to as baseload power, which really is nothing more than just power. It's just a matter of when and how much it's used. And I try to approach energy policy from a practical perspective. I don't think it needs to be partisan. I think it needs to make sense for Minnesota, and I think we need to be moving in the right direction. For this particular bill, we talk about the cost of nuclear plants, right? And we know they're very expensive to construct and build and to maintain and to operate. We understand that. We also know that there's indirect cost of the storage of the spent fuel. We cannot deny that. Everybody recognizes that. And I think we do owe something to the Prairie Island community and the other surrounding community about how we go forward and address this storage issue. You know, I don't know how soon we can depend on the federal government to make up their mind what they're going to do, but I think it needs to be part of our conversation here. But with respect to what is often referred to as baseload power, just to give you an example of why this is important, I would love to see us go to 100% renewables tomorrow, right? If we could flip a switch and we could do that and we could maintain exactly what we have today, then by all means let's do that, but it's not practical. I think we need to move in that direction. But in northern Minnesota, Minnesota Power happens to be the utility that serves the area where I live. 60% of their revenues, 60% of their revenues is made up by 12 customers. And we had testimony earlier this session, Mr. Chair, you'll remember this, that testified to how important that reliable, affordable power is to our employers. Now, we can say, you know what, we're going to make a change and your rates are going to go up and we're going to drive you out of business. We could say that because it's that important that we make this change to 100% renewables. I think there's a better way. I think there's a smarter way. Perspective. Those 12 customers, 6 of them are operating iron mines, right? There's been a lot of discussion over the last couple of years about mining in northern Minnesota. We're not going down that path right now, but just to give you a sense is that as that conversation has occurred, I have heard from all sides of the perspective, all sides of the equation that while we may be opposed to a certain type of mining, we all support iron ore mining. That has been a consistent message from the beginning. And to give you an example, one operating iron ore mine uses the equivalent amount of energy in one day as the city of Minneapolis. The city of Minneapolis is equivalent to the same energy use as one operating iron ore mine. So when we talk about baseload power and how important it is to northern Minnesota, that's why I get concerned about the discussion about making the transition. So as we go forward, I think nuclear power has to be part of the discussion. Large hydro has to be part of the discussion. All of our energy sources has to be part of the discussion, and this is where we agree. We've got to figure this out. But just to say that we're going to go to 100% renewables tomorrow or in 2030 or 2050 without a plan, without the technology to get there, I think it's a little bit disingenuous to Minnesotans. So I love the spirit of your bill, right? I think this bill is where we maybe get to after we have the conversation. And I hope that, one thought I had is that this perhaps is a discussion for the LEC, right? I mean, that in theory is perhaps what it's for, is to have this discussion about where nuclear fits in Minnesota's portfolio going forward. And maybe after that discussion, when we make a decision and we have a better understanding of what we're going to do with the spent fuel, maybe we come back and we get to this bill. I think, this is a bill. It's a conversation that we need to have, but I think that this step comes later. And I know we're not voting on it today anyway, but I think it's important just to get these points on the record. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Marty.
Mr. Chair, just one or two quick comments about some of the points that Senator Pratt made a few minutes ago, one of which is that if we don't pass this bill, that nuclear won't be part of the discussion. I think nuclear is going to be part of the discussion as soon as some technological breakthrough that you're saying happens all the time, which they do. As soon as that happens, I've just been observing for many decades now and seeing the cost of nuclear, unlike the cost of other new technologies, they keep dropping. This one seems to keep going up. Maybe that's just my imagination, but every time Prairie Island or Monticello needs work, every time they shut them down for changes, cost overruns. The costs projected to be in hundreds of millions of bucks, and every time they seem to almost double the cost that they project. And so, yes, this will be part of the discussion, but I don't think it's going to be part of the real discussion of what's likely to happen in the next 10, 15, 20 years until there is some sort of breakthrough, at which time I think that is. Having said that, I think Senator Osmek introducing this bill every couple of years I think these are healthy conversations, but your mention of the nuclear waste, and that if we pass this, then we'll get serious about addressing the waste. I think the problem isn't that nobody's serious about addressing it. The trouble is there may not be a good answer to that. And I wish there was, and I think the Prairie Island Tribes letter makes it clear they more than anyone is hoping we have a solution to that. But I wish, I'd vote for this bill if voting for this bill meant we would find a solution to nuclear waste. But I don't think I think the bill is symbolic more than anything else. I don't think it's going to change anything in the debate here.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Marty. And I guess we will just disagree on what the impetus of that conversation is. I don't think we're going to have a real conversation until somebody's ready to put down some money into a project and actually get serious about it. There's no reason to have the conversation with this ban in place. As far as your earlier comment about this just being political theater, I found an article from November 23rd, 2009, and Mr. Chair, if I could just quote a couple of quick passages from that article. Democrat Tim Walz and Republican Eric Paulson will join forces on Tuesday to call for a repeal of Minnesota's moratorium on nuclear power plants. The article goes on to say that Walls and Paulson say the state can't be left behind as the federal government moves forward on new energy sources. So it looks like we have bipartisan support, or have had bipartisan support on this. The governor has been on the record as saying we need to lift this ban. He's come out with his 100% carbon-free. I think now's the time to have the conversation on all carbon-free energy sources.
Senator Marty.
Just, Mr. Chair, just one clarification. I did not call it political theater. I said it doesn't do much other than accomplish a political point, make a political point, or make a political statement, I think was the term I used. But I'm not saying it's unhealthy to have these discussions. I'm just saying I want to make it clear I did not describe it as political theater.
Senator Marty, Mr. Chair, Senator Marty, you're right. That's my term.
All right, Ms. Levin, thank you for your testimony, and thank you for coming to share with us.
Thank you.
Senator Osmek.
Thank you. Just to wrap up, we always have a good conversation every 2 years. Unfortunately, we really haven't moved this before. I will disagree with Senator Marty in this respect on this. I will agree with him that there isn't a lot of action on what this does. But I disagree with you in this respect, that we need to allow the PUC the tools it needs to determine the future of Minnesota's power. And this is where Senator Simonson and I are going to disagree also. We need to do this now. It's not something that's as urgent as the impending snowstorm that's about to hit us, but it is urgent in this respect. It takes a long time to plan a resource such as this, to go through all the permitting processes. Senator Simonson, you'll agree. How long have we been working on the Twin Metals facility or the non-ferrous mining facilities up in the Iron Range? It's gone on. We didn't have gray hair when that started, I think. But the planning for this and the inclusion of it may not happen today, may not happen tomorrow, it may not happen next week or even next year. But we know when these licenses are coming off on our facilities. We know where the cliff is, and that's 2032 is where it starts. We need to start that now. Does that, by not doing it now, we start to shortchange ourselves and we tie the hands of the Public Utilities Commission. That's it. And I don't think, honestly, we're going to build another nuclear facility in Minnesota. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. However, that's not for this body to decide. It's for the PUC to make the determination based on the costs of the ratepayers and the benefits that are incurred. So I leave it at that, and I appreciate the conversation, and I'm sure we will have more on this subject as we go forward.
With that, Senate File number 633 will be laid over for possible inclusion.
Thank you, members. Just as a snapshot of what we have for next week, on Tuesday we will have Senator Utke's pipeline bill for Enbridge Line 3. There is a Made in Minnesota bill that is going to be coming forward also to deal with that subject matter, and a couple of technical bills that will go to the floor. Thursday, Senator Senjum has, and he vamoosed. Senator Senjum has a Clean Energy First bill that he has been working on. We're going to be taking that up. We may or may not pass that out. And also, I have some language on a revolving loan fund for building EV charging stations that I've been working on, and we hopefully will have that ready to go for prime time on Thursday. Any questions? Seeing none and no further business, this committee is adjourned.